Jerry's a 36-year veteran, correct me anytime I'm wrong, Jerry, of the U.S. Army, Green Beret, one of the founders of the Delta Force, which is a strategic strike force, carried out some very adroit missions. In battle, Jerry was severely wounded, near critical at one point, and I saw the video. If you research this man, B-O-Y-K-I-N, on YouTube, you'll find a lot of stuff. And one tells a wonderful story of a friend of his who commandeered a helicopter because there was a wounded Army person out there, didn't know who he was, but he was going to get him. Right, Jerry? And when he showed up, it was his good buddy, Jerry, and thanks to that, you're alive. We thank the Lord. Retired in 2007. Jerry's an ordained minister. Do you have a church, or are you just a freelance? He's an executive, just as the church I go has a freelance minister. Jerry is a current day executive VP of the Family Research Council, which is a wonderful organization. Do you do that by telecommuting, or do you have to go to an office?
Oh, I drive to Washington.
Drive to D.C. And you still teach at Hampton City? And if there's anything I left out, feel free to add it when I come out here. He's a renowned expert on international terrorism, read Radical Islam, and on Marxism, on which he chooses to speak today. And he's a frequent guest on the Glenn Beck TV show. I never listened to his radio. Do you get on the radio too? So you can catch him for free on the radio or by subscription online TV. Thank you for coming, Jerry. We look forward to your remarks. And there'll be a Q&A period to follow. Okay?
I want to talk to you today about something that I'm really concerned about. Let me say this. I'm a registered Republican, and my wife is too, but she just cut her card up, her Republican card up the other day. She actually sent it back to the Republican Party in Virginia, and she said, don't send me any more communications until you get your act together. Now, you know why? Is because Karl Rove came out against the Tea Parties. Yeah. And when Karl Rove came out against the Tea Party, she said, I'm done with the Republican Party. Now let me say this, I'm definitely not a Democrat either, okay? So I consider myself an independent. You said this is nonpartisan, and I want you to understand, and I'm speaking to you today as a nonpartisan, but I will tell you that what I want to talk about today is a problem that both parties have created. About 3 years ago, I was down at Morning Star Ministries down in Fort Bell, South Carolina, and I was about to leave, and the head of Morning Star said to me, he said, hey, he said, before you go, he said, how about making a video? I said, on what? And he said, I don't care, whatever's on your heart. He said, just go make a video. I sat down and made a 6-minute video. And the guy that's here with me today told me that it is the most viral video they've ever done in Morning Star Ministries, and now there's millions of hits on it. And it was talking off the cuff about Marxism in America. Because you see, I understand Marxism. And the reason I understand Marxism is because I grew up in Special Forces, and part of the training in Special Forces was to learn about Marxist insurgencies, because so many of the insurgencies that we've had to deal with throughout the history of American warfare have been inspired and stimulated by Marxism. They're Marxist revolutions. So I started looking at what was happening in America and trying to put things together and understand things. And as a result of that, I discovered that America is rapidly becoming a Marxist nation, and I'm very concerned about it. Thank God for the Tea Parties. Thank God that You are patriots. First and foremost, you are patriots. And that's what I appreciate so much about the Tea Parties. You know, I grew up in the 60s. I was in college in the 60s. So let me give you a quick test. I normally do this with a PowerPoint, but here's the question. What happened to the Marxist, anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-war, dope-smoking, free love, Woodstock hippies of the 60s?
Teachers.
Okay, what happened to them? Well, let me give you some choices. Okay, here's the choices. If you think this is what happened to them, raise your hand. They grew up, they wised up, they got jobs, and they raised families, and they became conservatives. Okay, we got one that thinks that's what they did. Okay, here's the next one. They tripped on LSD and wound up on Mars, where they live in communes today. No hands. No hands. All right. How about this one? They all went to San Francisco and ran for the U.S. Congress. Well, that's partially true, not all of them. And how about the final one? They went underground and they planned for the future takeover of America. And that's exactly what they did. You see, they developed a strategic plan over time. And let me tell you what that plan is. To take over America. Now, you can call me Joe McCarthy if you want to, but as I've done my research on it, the fact of the matter is, McCarthy wasn't that far off the mark. He really wasn't that far off the mark. Oh, there's, you know, we still talk about McCarthyism and so forth, but McCarthy was not that far off in what he was trying to say. Maybe his methodology was off, but he wasn't that far off. The fact of the matter is, the Communist Party infiltrated America in about 1932. And now you're seeing it manifest in ways that, in my generation, I never would have believed that we would see the kinds of things happening that are happening in America today. And again, I'm going to tell you, it's both parties. Both parties have contributed to it. Well, what they decided in their strategic plan is they would use the theology of Marxism and the methodology of the Communist Party USA. Any of you ever heard of it? Communist Party USA? Been here a long time. To foment, listen to this, cultural revolution in America. Cultural revolution in America. Okay? They're going to use the Marxist theology and methodology of the Communist Party to foment cultural revolution. They will use the teachings of Saul Alinsky. Does anybody know who Saul Alinsky is? Saul Alinsky was a hardcore radical Marxist who wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. They would eventually find someone that would finance their plan, their strategy, and they would eventually find a Messiah. And the question is, we know who the financier is. They found the sugar daddy. They found him in a guy named George Soros. The question is Barack Hussein Obama the Messiah? Some would say yes, some would say no. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Because the fact of the matter is, his predecessor, George W. Bush, never met a spending bill that he didn't like. So, have they found the Messiah? I leave that question for you to ponder. Now, what is Marxism, communism, and socialism? The fact of the matter is, a lot of people really don't understand what they use those terms synonymously. They say, well, he's a socialist. What they really mean is he's a communist. Or he's a communist, and they really mean he's a socialist. Well, let me tell you the truth. They're different, but they are frequently found together. Marxism, communism, socialism. Socialism is actually an economic system. And socialism works for a while, but it eventually fails. It always fails. Socialism always fails. You want a proof of that? Look at the continent of Europe, which is very socialist. And now it is failing. And look at what's happening on the continent of Europe. All these social programs in Europe are failing. They have run them into bankruptcy. And you've got huge riots in places like Greece and Italy and Portugal unemployment. Spain, you know what the real unemployment rate is in Spain now? It's about 40%. The real unemployment, they'll say 26, it's about 40. It's an absolute failure. The socialist system has absolutely failed on the continent of Europe. And by the way, that's where we're headed. That's where we're going as a nation. So stand firm in what you believe, Tea Party politics. Stand firm in what you believe. Communism and Marxism, and I would say that generally speaking, communism and Marxism is the same thing, but it's different than socialism. Socialism is an economic system. Communism and Marxism is essentially the same, but they don't work. They've never worked the way that Karl Marx designed them to work when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1948. When they're put into practice, they actually are different than what he wrote about. His was all theology, no practice. And when they actually put them into practice, they always fail, but they are never exactly what he wrote about. So what did Karl Marx believe? What did he write about in the Communist Manifesto? He said that he had a huge disdain for capitalism. In fact, Karl Marx said, my objective, how many of you know this? My objective is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism. He hated capitalism. All right? And Karl Marx advocated revolution. So you hear so much about Marxist revolutions. He advocated revolution. He said that's the only way that you can change the society is to have revolution. And in order to do that, you have to divide the society into two classes of people. It's class warfare. Does this sound familiar? Yes. Class warfare. Marx said you got to have revolution in order to change the society. And you got to divide the nation, the society, into two classes of people. The first is the proletariat, the workers. That's us, by the way. The workers, the proletariat, who never get anything. And the bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie, which are the wealthy, the elite, that control everything. Sounds an awful lot like Occupy Wall Street, doesn't it? 99% against the 1%. That's class warfare. That's exactly what that Occupy Wall Street is. It is right out of the Marxist playbook, dividing the nation into two categories. Well, here's the bottom line. It's absolutely false. We have a huge middle class that is the backbone of America. It's not 99% against 1%, but that was the terminology that was used because it is pure Marxism. Okay? He says class warfare must occur in order to create the conditions that lead to revolution. And what we have seen is we have seen a continued movement towards dividing this country into classes. You know, it may be the wealthy against the poor, it may be men against women, it may be based along racial lines, blacks against whites, against Hispanics, but it's all about class warfare. This is all part of the Marxist methodology. Divide the nation, get them in different categories, and then they will eventually fight each other, and you will have the revolution that Karl Marx called for. He also said that revolutionary leadership, somebody has to lead the revolution, is essential only until the revolution has succeeded, and at that time, those leaders go away, and what you wind up with is you wind up with the party, the Communist Party, which essentially becomes everything, to include your God. That's why every communist society is officially atheist. Now, what's important about that is, remember when the Founding Fathers wrote our Constitution, they founded this country on an absolutely and totally unique concept that they had never seen in Europe, where most of them came from. Most of them came over from Europe, right up the river here, right, in 1607, at a place called Jamestown. And where'd they come from? Most of you would say England. The fact of the matter was most of them came from Holland. And they came from Holland because they had rejected the authority of the King of England, who declared himself to be the head of the church as well as the head of state, and they said, no, we reject the authority of the king in spiritual matters. No king but King Jesus. So they went to Holland to get away from the king, where there was a more religious freedom. And then they came to America and they settled Jamestown. And this concept of inalienable rights, rights that came from God, not from man, became so prevalent in the thinking of the colonies that when men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington, and where were they from? Virginia. Don't ever forget, Virginia was the key colony. Virginia was the key colony. Not only in the separation from the crown and the Declaration of Independence, but in the Constitution, because in spite of what people tell you about the Federalist Papers being written for the people of New York, the truth is the colony that really had to ratify that Constitution was Virginia. We were the key colony. But they founded this nation on something called inalienable rights. Rights that came from God, not from the king, not from the government, not from the royalty, but from God. Now stop and think about that. If we as a people believe that our rights come from God, we'll never be totally dependent upon the government, right? And you can't have that if you're going to be a Marxist, communist society. That's one of the reasons you see so many attacks on the Christian faith today. So much effort to deny the history of America and to deny that this nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, period. Plain and simple. So you attack that faith, you attack the character of the founding fathers, you start to rob us of our identity as a nation, and then you can change our society. All communist nations are officially atheist nations. My objective is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism. Karl Marx went on to say, the opiate of the masses is religion. The opiate of the masses. We get high on religion. And that's why he was determined that we had to have an atheist society. Karl Marx went on to say, we'll govern ourselves without any elected central government. No, it's not elected. It's just that the wealthy, the elite, actually dominate because they're called the party, the Communist Party. It says people are instinctively good and will do what is necessary for the greater good of society. That runs counter to the nature of mankind. That's why what he wrote about was such a fallacy. That's not the nature of mankind. We don't do what's instinctively good unless we are held in check by something greater than ourselves, and that goes back to the concept of inalienable rights. And I'm not trying to give you a sermon this afternoon, but what I'm trying to make you understand is why America was so unique. What is American exceptionalism? And we were exceptional because we were founded on this concept of inalienable rights. That was the foundation for American exceptionalism. We were different because every place else in the world, your rights came from the ruling elite, which was normally the royal family. Karl Marx said that there will be no private ownership. No one will own anything. In fact, he made his famous statement. It said, from each, according to his abilities, to each, according to his need. His objective was a utopian, classless society, which was false from the beginning because the party still maintains the status of being the elite. So it's not a classless society, but that's what he wrote about. It's never been achieved, and sadly there are still people in America, as well as around the world, that still believe that that could be achieved, and it will not be achieved. It's never been achieved. Here was one of his mottos. Workers of the world unite. What does that remind you of? Unions. Unions. Unions have actually served a great purpose in America today. But we've got to look at each one of these unions now to determine whether they are working against the future of America. But that was his terminology. Workers of the world unite. See, it was more of that class warfare. Socialism is primarily an economic system. It works in a democracy, a communist state, or a dictatorship. But only for a while. Eventually, socialism will fail. Guaranteed. It allows for the practice of capitalism to an extent. It focuses on the distribution and the redistribution of wealth. But you have government controls on the economy and it distributes the wealth. I didn't say redistributes. It distributes the wealth. In other words, we all work together. We all work for the state, for the Communist Party, and then the Communist Party will determine how much of that you're going to get, sir, and how much, ma'am, you're going to get. It's all done by the party. And we see a lot of signs of that being where we're headed. And it promotes an attitude of entitlements. I'm entitled to something. And that is very much where we see ourselves today. This whole attitude of entitlements. There's an ideal communism versus an actual communism. Marx believed in ideal communism, but Lenin and Stalin implemented an actual communism. Now, let me ask you, communism is actually a geopolitical system as well as an economic system. It relies on the government control of production. All production is controlled by the government. It calls for communal ownership of the property, and it establishes the party as a central government, and it eliminates God from society, which is why they are always atheist. Actual communism, what was implemented by Karl Marx and Lenin, I mean not Marx and Lenin, but Lenin and Stalin, was actually that everything belonged to the party. The party is the highest power, there is no God, and people receive what the party gives them. And they use socialism as a pathway to getting to this communist state. The ruling elite are members of the party. The party controls all production. The party determines all spending. Starting to sound familiar? This is right out of the playbook, by the way. And then the proletariat, the workers of the world unite. The workers get only what the party provides. Entitlements. Sound familiar? I didn't make this stuff up. Right out of the book. Wages and prices are controlled by the party, and the needs of the proletariat are a responsibility of the party. And non-party workers, if you're not a member of the Communist Party, you suffer. You have a very hard time getting anything. That, again, sounds a little bit like the unions. If you're not in a right-to-work state, in many ways, you can't even work unless you join a union. I don't see how that could be constitutional, first of all. That you can't get a job unless you are part of a union. I don't see the constitutionality of that, but we've been living with that. Now, I want you to listen to what I'm about to read you. This is from Vladimir Lenin. This is about America. This is what Lenin said. America is like a healthy body. And its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within. Patriotism, its morality, and its spiritual life. Now, how many of you in here have ever seen the video called Agenda? Not Agenda 21, Agenda. Grinding America Down. Curtis Powers. And I just, over at my home in Farmville, I just, about 2 months ago, did some videos with Curtis for his second iteration of this. I want to tell you about this video. And I want all of you to go online to Amazon this afternoon and order a copy of this. Because it is going to shock you when you watch this video. Here's what Curtis Bauer said. Curtis Bauer said in 1992 he was a graduate student and a reporter came to him and said, I want you to go over, he's from Idaho, he was in the state legislature in Idaho, but at this time he's a graduate student over in Idaho. He said, I want you to go over to UC Berkeley, there's a Communist Party USA meeting, and he said, I want you to go over there and attend this meeting and take notes and let me know what they say. So he said he went over there. And he said the first thing he noticed was these were not college students. He said these were 50s, 60s, 70-year-olds at this meeting, Communist Party USA, and he said they laid out their plan for how they would take over America, and he said, I went home and laughed at them and said, you will never do those things in America. And he said, then I found a book called The Naked Communist, written in 1958, The Naked Communist. He said, so I read it, and I said, holy mackerel, these people have been talking about doing this at least since 1958 when they wrote it in The Naked Communist. It's actually a pretty famous book. And let me tell you what they said they were going to do to take over America. Now listen to this. They're going to infiltrate the institutions of America and take over from within. Now reflect back on what Lenin said. Vladimir Lenin said we've got to undermine these things in order to destroy America. So they're going to infiltrate the institutions of America and take over from within. They will promote cohabitation versus marriage. Do you realize that cohabitation, living together without marriage, is just as popular today as marriage is? It's a 49-51 split. 49% of people in America today that are together are not married. Secondly, they're going to get children away from the families as soon as possible. Does that sound like universal daycare? That's what it is. Get the children, this is not my words, this is right out of the Naked Communist. Get children away from families as soon as possible. You remember a guy named Gorbachev? Well, his wife had a PhD. You know what his wife said in her PhD thesis? She said, one of the problems is these children are spending too much time at home and they're being infatuated by fairy tales. You know what the fairy tale was? God. They're being infatuated by fairy tales. God. Universal daycare. Here's what else they said they would do. They would support the feminist movement to create discontent with motherhood. My friends, this is about the family. You see, the most important element in America today is not the church. You can worship God according to your faith without ever stepping inside a church. I don't suggest you do that, because I think from my perspective, the Bible is very clear. You need to be with other believers. You need to be under the spiritual leadership of a pastor who is trained and versed, but you could. But there's one thing you can't do without, and that is the family, because if you don't have the family, the whole society suffers. Now let me give you some statistics. I work at the Family Research Council. I can show you from the research that we have done that the most important entity in your society in terms of low crime rate, high education, graduation from high school, personal health, and a variety of other things to include education is the intact family. Here's an example. The state of New York spends $12,000 a student per year, and their graduation rate in the state of New York is under 60% from high school. The state of Minnesota spends $7,000 per year per student, and their graduation rate is about 81%. What's the difference? The difference is the intact families in Minnesota, of all places. I know Jesse Ventura, but the intact family, mother, father, child, is double that of New York. You think it doesn't make a difference? Every leading indicator shows that the intact family, this is about destroying the family. You destroy the family, you can destroy the church. And people are still going to find a way to worship, and the living proof of that is all these communist nations that even when they were officially atheists, they still worship. I spend time in Romania from time to time, and those people tell me they didn't care. They were willing to risk their lives to come together in corporate prayer for the nation. But you destroy the family and you destroy the society, and that's what this is about. And then they said they would support the environmental movement in order to destroy businesses. Do we see that in America today? Do we see that? Why are we not energy independent? It's the green movement. It's the green movement. It's the environmentalists. The only reason that we don't make ourselves energy independent is because of the Greens movement. It's become a religion for them. And again, many of them, and I'm an environmentalist, I love to hunt and fish. And I want to take care of the environment because I want my grandchildren to enjoy exactly the same thing. But it has become a religion for many of these people. Here's what else they said. They'll destroy the morals of America by getting America to accept homosexuality as a normal behavior. Eliminate prayer in schools. This is their words. They will eliminate prayer in school. Now let me be clear. I don't want the teachers leading my children and my grandchildren in prayer. Because I don't know what their theology is. I don't know what they believe. I don't know who they're praying to. But I want my children to have the opportunity. I don't want them to be restricted from being able to pray themselves in school or organize themselves with like-minded people to worship in school. They will discredit the family as an institution. They will promote promiscuity and easy divorce. Get control of the schools through teachers' unions. This is their words. Use the school curriculum to promote socialism. And eliminate obscenity laws and call it free speech. Think about that one. They will break down the cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography. It is absolutely incredible. First of all, it's about a $16 billion industry today. It's absolutely incredible how many families are being destroyed by pornography today, and it is probably, I'm told by a number of pastors, it is the leading cause of divorce inside the church today. And by the way, it's not just a problem for men. The number of women that are addicted to pornography today is incredible. It's growing. Promote homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Infiltrate the media, get control of key positions on radio, TV, and motion pictures. Do you think they've infiltrated the media? Now listen to this. These two. Infiltrate the church and replace revealed religion with social religion. In other words, I'm a social Christian. I don't really believe in the Bible. Well, that's not the way the nation was founded. You can believe what you want to. I support your right. In fact, I spent 36 years doing just that. Believe what you want to. But I will tell you that that was their words. And then finally, discredit the Bible. Discredit the Bible. Now, let me switch over to something here. And I'm going to just repeat in just a few minutes sort of what I covered in that little 6 or 7 minute video that has had so many millions of views as I talked about Marxism and Marxism. If you look at the Marxist model, you look at what Lenin did, if you look at what Mao Zedong did, if you look at what Chavez did down in Venezuela, you'll see that they all follow a pattern. And here's what they do. They nationalize major sectors of the economy. Okay? I want to tell you that's what the bailouts were. And somebody can say, well, they're paying us back. Well, not so fast. First of all, they haven't paid us back on all of that stuff. But the point is, you start this pattern where you rush in and you bail out somebody that took extraordinary risks, that were told to loan people money they couldn't afford a house in the beginning. And then you rush in and bail them out. But folks, this is Marxism. The auto bailouts, the bank bailouts, insurance bailouts, that's nationalizing major sectors of the economy, and that is part of the Marxist model. Second thing they do is they redistribute wealth. That started, by the way, in case you think that started under Barack Obama, it didn't. It started under a guy back in about 1932. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's when it all started. Healthcare, in fact, in the current administration, even the guy that handles Medicare and Medicaid stood up and said very boldly, and I'm sure he got counsel about it, but he said very boldly, well, healthcare is just a redistribution of wealth. Part of the Marxist model. Tax the rich. That's part of it. That's part of redistribution of wealth and government jobs. In other words, you don't grow the private sector, you grow the government because you control those jobs. It's happening in America. Third thing you see is you see them start to discredit the opposition, the people, the Tea Parties. Discredit the Tea Parties so that they lose their influence. Discredit others. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security came out with a memo talking about future threats to America. Who did they identify? Right-wing Christian groups, pro-life groups, Second Amendment groups, and what else? Returning veterans. I'm angry. I'm still angry about it. I got that thing laying on my desk up at the Family Research Council. I read that thing, and here's the reason that I've got it there. It's because now there's a pattern of repeating that over and over and over. I don't know how many of you saw the story, but there was a lieutenant colonel at Fort Campbell, Kentucky that sent an email out to about 34 of his subordinates saying that the threats that his men should stay away from were these same groups that were identified in that memo in 2009. And then there was a training up in either Maryland or Pennsylvania, an Army Reserve training unit up there that did the same exact thing, told all the people, you got to stay away from these groups. Identifying us. Look, I'm a Christian. I'm an ordained minister, and I don't care whether you believe what I believe or not, but I know that I have a right to believe and talk about what I believe in. And I am angry at being called a threat to America because of my Christian beliefs. Because I know that what I believe is essentially what the nation was founded on. Somebody would say, well, but we had slavery. You know what? You know who brought about the end of slavery? The church. It was the church, it was Christians that brought it about in the Second Great Awakening. And oh, by the way, do you know how the Second Great Awakening started? There were two men over here at Hampton-Sydney College. You know, Hampton-Sydney was the 10th oldest college or university in America. There were two men over there at Hampton-Sydney College. In 1798, they came back from working the tobacco fields in the summer, and they were, now how many of you are Presbyterian? The frozen chosen, right? You know what they call you? The frozen chosen. That was before. Hampton-Sydney was a Presbyterian seminary at that time. And these two young men came back. You can look this up on the web. They came back in the summer of 1798, and they were so eager to know God's will for their lives that they started doing something that Presbyterians don't do, and that was they started praying out loud. Oh, acting like Pentecost. Praying out loud. And they started going out in the woods and praying and singing hymns. And then the weather set in, and they went back into the dormitory there, and the other students came to them and said, stop, knock that off. Said, you're disturbing us. Said, we can't study. Now, I teach college students. They don't study to start with. But they said, you got to quit this. We can't study. So they took them to the chancellor. The chancellor said, now, you boys got to knock that off. It's out of order. And they said, sir, we are seeking God. We want to know how God wants to use our lives. And he said, well, if you're going to continue doing this, then do it in my parlor. That parlor is still there at Hampton-Sydney, by the way. It's in the president's home there. So they moved into the parlor. And they started praying out loud and singing hymns and seeking God. And finally, guess what happened? The other boys started kind of getting up there real close. see what these two knuckleheads were doing, and all of a sudden a Christian revival broke out. And people started really coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and they went all the way up through Virginia and all the way into Pennsylvania. It was called the Hampton-Sydney Revival. Look it up. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is when they graduated in 1780, they went and bought mules with what little bit of money they had, and they went across the Appalachian Mountains with their Bibles, and they started preaching in what we know today as Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and the lower Ohio Valley. At first there was only 2, but then there was 5 at the next meeting, and then there was 10, and then 100. It's called the Second Great Awakening. You hear of the Cambridge Revival, and Harriet Beecher Stowe and all that, but it started right here at Hampton-Sydney College. And they began to raise the awareness of the inconsistency of these words. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and you cannot hold the black man a slave and believe in those words. And they raised the awareness, the consciousness of America, and we fought a civil war to end the evil of slavery. It was the church, folks. And I think it's important that we understand that when they attack us because of our faith, they're not recognizing the influence of the Judeo-Christian base or the influence of the Christian faith in the history of America. It's helped to make America great. There's also, under this discrediting the opposition, I think you will remember that our current president publicly at a State of the Union message criticized the Supreme Court for a decision, a ruling they made. That's discrediting what is the opposition. Never been done before. Never in a public place. I'm telling you, it's part of the Marxist model. Then censorship is another part of the Marxist model. You censor. Many of you heard of the hate crimes legislation. That's what it is. You know what hate crimes legislation is aimed at? It's not aimed at the media. It's aimed at you, sir. It's aimed at the pulpits, where you have an audience and where you have a directive from God Himself to stand firmly on biblical truth. Hate crimes legislation. I was given this same presentation at a convention down in Atlanta, North American Missions Board for the Southern Baptist denomination, and 2 guys in there stood up and said, "Could we speak?" "Yes," I said. They said, "Listen to what the man's telling you. We're from Canada." He said, "We spoke out against Islam," and he spoke out against same-sex marriage, and he said, and some of our friends did the same thing. He said, "We got locked up." They locked us up in Canada because of hate crimes legislation. Be careful. Now here's one that you'll see in the Marxist model too, and that's a thing called gun control. Let me ask you this. If you've been in Boston the other day when the police had 20 square blocks surrounded and said there's a killer on the loose, stay in your house, would you have felt better with or without a gun? This is insane. The Founding Fathers wrote the Second Amendment not for squirrel hunters. They wrote it so that American citizens could protect themselves and their property, and so that they would never have to fear a tyrannical government. That was the purpose of the Second Amendment. We must protect the Second Amendment. And oh, by the way, and I know Wayne LaPierre very well, the Executive Vice President of the National Rifle Association. Do any of you in here know why the National Rifle Association was created? It was created to protect black people, because Bubba did not want these blacks that had been freed to have a gun. And the National Rifle Association was created to ensure that blacks had the constitutional right to own guns. But today they are vilified, almost crucified, because they stand firmly on a constitutional right called the Second Amendment. Then in the Marxist model, they talk about, and you see in every Marxist revolution, you see a constabulary force, somebody to control the population. Now the president said, and I'm just quoting his words, if I'm elected president, I'll have a national civilian security force as large and as well equipped as the U.S. military. For what? For what? We've got the National Guard, we've got police at every level. What do we need a constabulary force for? What do we need a national civilian security force for? Think about it. And then finally, what you see them begin to do in every Marxist movement is they begin to destroy the faith of the people, the religion people turn to in times of difficulty. And you see today the Christian faith in particular is under the greatest assault that it has ever been under in this nation. And by the way, the examples I gave you a few minutes ago were only the tip of the iceberg. At Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where we train our majors in the U.S. Army, they wrote a war game, a domestic war game, and in that war game, they identified exactly the same groups that were identified in that 2009 DHS memo as the enemy. And they did the same thing in a document that was written at the Counterterrorism Center at West Point, identifying the same groups. And by the way, if you are a Bible-believing Christian, you're one of those that they're talking about, just so you know. I'm going to kind of skip down to the end of this because I've got a lot of information here, but let me just go to this. What do we do? What do we do about what's happening in America? We are moving towards becoming a Marxist nation, and oh, by the way, it's both parties. It is not unique to the Democrats or to the Obama administration. It is both parties. Let me tell you, those people that you, the Tea Party patriots, put in office in 2010, you better get ready and pull out all stops and do it again in 2014. Because I know a lot of those Tea Party patriots. I know a lot of those people that you helped to get into office. And they're the only ones up there right now that are standing firm. And some of them will turn out to be a disappointment. But here's what happens to them, because I'm on the Hill every week talking to different members of Congress. When they got in there, the likes of the leadership of the Republican Party got them all together and said, now listen, you can listen to people like Michelle Bachmann, and Louis Gohmert, and Frank Wolf, our own, and I love Frank Wolf. You can listen to them, you can do what they tell you, but you'll never get reelected again. Or you can listen to what we tell you. So several of those Tea Party patriots decided to go with the I'm going to get elected again group. And very soon after they got in, about 2 months after they got in, they came up for a vote on the raising the debt ceiling, and they all voted for it. And when they went home back to Richmond and Tallahassee and Kansas City, they got their heads handed to them by the people that helped get them in office. The Tea Party that said, didn't you understand why we sent you to Washington? And they immediately did an about face and they said, we got the message. So stay with it. But, let me tell you what you need to do. You need to get informed. I dare say very few of you really know what's happening in this country. Most Americans don't, period. See, we're in a period of amusement. Muse means to think, amuses without thinking. And what happens in America is we sit mindlessly in front of a doggone television, watching reality TV, which is not reality to begin with, or NFL football, or some cooking show, and we take sound bites because we don't read. You know how much of America reads? 24% actually reads books. And we take a sound bite, and it might be a political campaign ad, a 30-second campaign ad, which says, The Republicans are for Wall Street, the Democrats are for the common man, and that's, they form their opinion based on that without doing any further research. It is important that we get beyond the television. And by the way, if you're watching the mainstream media and thinking you're getting all the story, you are not. To include Fox News, and I do Fox more than anybody else, I mean, than any other. In fact, MSNBC won't even have me on anymore, which breaks my heart. Really bothers me. But Fox News is not giving you the whole story either. You got to find other sources, get informed, find out what's going on. There are many, many other ways to get information than just watching it. Vote. If you don't vote, don't complain. If you're not registered, go register now. I know the election's not until the fall. Go vote. Get registered to vote. Get your neighbors registered to vote. And it really doesn't matter who they vote for. It does to me, but at the end of the day, it's a constitutional right. It's the most fundamental thing the Founding Fathers gave us was the right to vote. Vote. Support candidates. Get in behind the candidates. In case you want to know who I'm supporting for the Lieutenant Governor, Bishop E.W. Jackson. What I did a fundraiser for him the other day up in Leesburg. Let me tell you something, the man's the real deal. I'm not here to convince you to vote for E.W. Jackson, but you better. This guy, first of all, you may not have noticed, but he's black. Yeah. And he's a conservative, and he ain't just a Johnny-come-lately, he's a real conservative that loves America, that loves our Constitution, and he's a lawyer. Sadly, he's a Harvard graduate. Even more sadly, he's a Marine. But I'll tell you what, he's the real deal. And I'm supporting him. But get out and support the candidates that you believe in. Do all you can. The Tea Party made a huge difference in 2010. Support the candidates with traditional American values. And hold the leaders accountable. Let me tell you something. If you're not on the email or on the phone every day calling your representative. My wife has bugged Robert Hurt so bad. He actually sent one of his aides down to Farmville to tell her that he understands, would you please back off, he said. She is on the email or on the phone every single day, telling them how she feels about things. You've got to let them know and stand firm. And oh, by the way, I told you I'm a conservative. I've voted for a Democrat before, too. Because there are conservative Democrats, believe it or not. There are conservative Democrats. And I voted for one right over in my county over there after talking to him and finding out exactly where he stood. Hold leaders accountable. Let them know how you feel about things. Get involved with groups. Get involved with the Tea Party. Get involved with the Oak Initiative. I'm on the board of the Oak Initiative. You can look it up. Get involved with something. It makes a difference. Stand and be counted. Speak out. Do not be intimidated by what somebody's going to say about you. Look, if you get any worse press than I do, call me and I'll sympathize with you. Okay? You got to quit worrying about what people are saying about you. And at the end, if you can't find somebody that you trust, then run for office. I'm not talking about running for president. I'm talking about the school board, the city council. Hey, I know a woman down in Jacksonville, Florida. She's a black woman. She's a dear, dear friend of mine. She's a former prostitute. She ran for office down there on the city council. And the Republican Party tried to buy her off. She ran as a Democrat because they already had a Republican candidate, so she ran as a Democrat. She's conservative, former prostitute. She's now an ordained minister, by the way. She took out a big page, one-page ad in the Jacksonville paper, said, "My name is Kimberly Daniels. I'm a former prostitute, but today I'm an ordained minister serving the King and preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ." And she ran for office. She won. She won with over 60%. The Republican Party offered her $100,000 trying to buy her off. People went out and put piece of paper on the windshield of the car saying, "Nigger, get out of the race." They couldn't intimidate this woman. This woman's street smart. She's tough. She got elected. She got on the city council. The first thing that came up was this guy that's the Human Rights Commissioner for Jacksonville came in and said, and he, by the way, he is known to be associated with the Muslim Brotherhood in America. He came in and said, "I want $800,000 to go out and bring aid to the black community here in Jacksonville, Florida." She's the only one on that city council that stood up and said, "You are not getting $800,000 to go in there and proselytize my black brothers and sisters." And then all the rest of them chimed in and said, "Yeah, I think she's right. I think she don't want to have guts. One more." And she said, "If you got $800,000, I tell you what we'll do with it. We'll give it to the police and the firefighters." And they did. And guess who's the most popular city council person down there? She takes on, every time she gets in trouble, she calls me. She says, "Oh, I'm in it again. What do I do?" I always wind up finding somebody to help. And then finally, I'll just say this: pray for America. Pray for America. I don't even pray for God to bless America. I pray for God to forgive America for what we've become, for the way we've invited Him to lead our society. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to kind of finish with this. My wife and I, in 2011, we had all 6 of our precious grandchildren in our home, and 3 of them were boys. And at that time, they were 3, 3, and 2. We could not hear ourselves. You love to see them come, and you love to see them go. They were, oh my gosh, we let them be boys. We don't medicate them, we let them be boys. We want them to grow to be men, real men. And we just let them be boys. But when they left, we stood in the kitchen and we just said, what kind of country are they going to grow up in? Will they know the America that we knew? Will they know the freedoms that we knew? And we said, not the way we're going, they won't. So she and I looked at each other and said, what? We will do whatever we have to do for the rest of our life. For as long as God gives us here on this earth, we're going to do all we can do to make sure we've done our part to ensure that those children, those 6 precious grandchildren, know the America that we grew up in. You know this, so I suspect that I commanded the Delta Force during the events that you know as Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu, Somalia. On the 3rd of October 1993, we fought a tremendous battle. 18 hours, and by the way, do you know what we were fighting over? 2 dead bodies. We weren't fighting because we couldn't get out of Mogadishu. It was because nobody would leave those 2 bodies that were trapped inside that Black Hawk. We wouldn't come out. We wouldn't leave them behind. This is why I am doing all I can right now to ensure accountability on Benghazi, because we violated we fought over 2 dead bodies for 18 hours. And any of you have heard me speak as I give my personal testimony. You know, my most vivid memory of Mogadishu was a 5-ton truck coming back 18 hours after we started that battle, rolling back in on our airfield. And the dead were in the bottom of that truck, and the wounded were stacked up on top of them. That's all we had to get them out with. And I walked over to drop the tailgate on that truck, and when that tailgate came down, the blood just poured out like water. And I just tell you, I was broken. It shook my faith. It shook me to my foundations as I said, God, where were you? But that's a different story, and what I want to tell you is that afternoon, late that afternoon, as I sat on my bunk just contemplating what had happened, my sergeant major walked up to me and he said, Colonel, are you ready to go? I got up and put my cap on, and I said, I'm ready, Sergeant Major. And I walked across the airfield and I followed him to the other side of the airfield. And that's where our base was. And we got to a tent over there, and there was up over the flap of that tent, it said Mortuary Affairs. And I knew what was inside. He pulled the flap back and he looked into my eyes and he said, sir? I said, I'm ready. I took a deep breath and I walked in. And when I walked in, a little staff sergeant met me and she said, sir, would you follow me? And I followed her. And there were 15 long black bags laid out in there. And she knelt down by the first one. She unzipped it and she opened it and she said, can you identify this man? And I looked into the cold, ashen face of a soldier that only a few hours earlier I'd been laughing with, joking with. And she went down that line and opened each one of those bags and said, can you identify this man? And every time I look into one of those bags, I ask myself the same question, and this is what that question is. I said, did I do everything I could? Did I do everything I could to make sure he was ready for this battle? To make sure he was properly trained, that he was properly equipped, that he understood the situation. And in my case, had he heard the gospel of Jesus Christ? Let me tell you something, folks. As morbid as that story may sound, it's a reminder to me that now is the time to do everything we can. When we're looking in that body bag of America, it's too late to ask that question because you can't go back. Now is the time for us to do everything we can. It's not about us. It's about our children and our grandchildren and generations to come. It's just like those founding fathers that were willing to step forward on the 2nd of July, 1776, and sign that document, knowing that they were drawing a big bullseye on their chest, because if they failed, they were going to be executed as traitors. But they signed it anyhow. 9 of them died as a result of that. Many of them lost everything they had. But the question we need to ask ourselves now, not then, now, have I done everything I can? Folks, I encourage you. Get involved. Do everything you can and stop this movement towards becoming a Marxist nation, which is not what our founding fathers created. I'll take your questions and God bless you. Thank you.